Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be here with Premier Kenney to announce a continuation of the supports that we are providing to small and medium-sized enterprises in response to COVID-19 and as we move through our relaunch. From day one, our government has supported job creators. Many of the first actions taken after forming government lifted the tax and regulatory burdens on businesses, and during COVID-19, we have continued to provide both broad-based and specialized supports to support our economy. We have already provided billions of dollars of supports to businesses throughout the pandemic, such as our deferral of WCB premiums and our program to pay half of those premiums for small and medium businesses, giving us amongst the highest per capita supports for small businesses among provinces. Those supports have helped many business owners, including Dawn, who is president of Exquisite Care, Senior Living and Care at Home, who has talked to us about how the relief from WCB premiums have helped them to be able to care for some of the most vulnerable Albertans throughout this pandemic. Today's announcement fills the #1 ask we have received from businesses and industry groups and is just another step that we are taking to ensure that Alberta's job creators, particularly the small businesses that are the backbone of our economy and such a critical part of our communities, are given the support they need. In particular, we want to ensure we are providing support to those businesses that have been forced to close or severely curtailed due to the public health orders in place to protect the health and safety of Albertans. Many of these businesses, due to factors that were completely outside of their control, saw drastic or complete reductions of their revenue and are now needing to make considerable changes to their businesses in order to ensure their employees and clients are safe. Albertans did the right thing and deserve the credit for flattening the curve and limiting the spread of COVID-19, and we need to ensure that we continue to follow guidelines and physically distance. We are relaunching our economy because of the hard work and sacrifice of Albertans. As part of that, we need to ensure that small businesses are given the tools they need to survive. We need to ensure that they can keep the lights on and their workers employed. Premier Kenney and I, as well as all members of our caucus and cabinet, have been listening to the communities and businesses that live in the villages, towns, and cities across our province. This week alone, I've hosted telephone town halls attended by thousands of businesses and organizations, ranging from libraries to tanning salons to gyms. What I have heard from the thousands of small and medium businesses I've spoken to is that they need working capital in order to keep their doors open. This announcement today is part of our response to those discussions and the feedback we've received. So with that, I will turn it over to Premier Kenney for a very exciting announcement.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and good morning. Great to be here with our Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism, Tanya Fir, and I want to thank her for her hard work on ensuring that Alberta job creators get through the COVID crisis. The extraordinary circumstances of the last 10 weeks have been very hard on Albertans, but perhaps hardest of all on our job creators. As I've said, Alberta is facing a triple whammy: the public health crisis, the global coronavirus recession, and the collapse in energy prices. All of that reflected in today's jobs stats coming from Statistics Canada, showing 15% unemployment in Alberta. That masks the reality because of the many tens of thousands of Albertans who've had to leave the labour force altogether. There is some small good news in that more people are returning to work and getting employed again. But we Albertans know that it's going to be a long time before we're out of the woods of the period of economic adversity we're facing. From retail to hospitality to tourism, many small business operations have been hard hit by the public health orders that either kept many of their customers at home or forced them temporarily to close their doors completely. These businesses are really the backbone of our economy, and so many of them are owner-operated, family-run businesses that I call the unsung heroes of our economy, the people who put a second mortgage on their house and work 70 or 90-hour weeks to keep that business going, worrying about whether they can make payroll. And that stress, of course, has been even greater over the past 3 months. But Alberta has managed the pandemic far better than most, allowing us to maintain the operation of about 85% of Alberta's businesses over the past 3 months of the pandemic. And that represents about 88% of Alberta's workforce and about 96% of our provincial GDP or economy. But it's true, 15% of businesses representing 12% of the provincial workforce did have to close their doors or significantly impair their operations because of the necessary public health orders that were put in place to prevent our healthcare system from being overwhelmed by the pandemic as it has been in many other places. Recognizing the huge importance of small and medium-sized businesses to our economy, I'm pleased to announce today further measures that make Alberta a leader in supporting job creators and ensuring a future for those who create employment. First, we're going to take measures to prevent businesses from being evicted by landlords who fail to act responsibly in their dealings with commercial tenants. The Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program is a partnership between Alberta's government and the federal government. We are contributing at least $67 million to provide a repayable loan for up to 50% of monthly costs if landlords cut the rent for a small business tenant by 75% and if they promise not to evict them. It's available to landlords for their small business tenants that have lost revenues of 70% or more and who pay less than $50,000 a month in rent. But small businesses have told us loud and clear that they need us to help fill a gap that has left some of them unable to get the support they need, because in many cases, commercial landlords are not signing up for this program, are not passing on this short-term COVID rent subsidy to those businesses that have been so heavy hit, and in some cases are threatening to evict commercial tenants, which we think is unacceptable during this unprecedented economic crisis. And so we're listening to those employers, and we've got their backs. By taking measures that will address actions of commercial landlords who fail to act responsibly and fairly by increasing rent or threatening eviction of tenants for non-payment, we'll address the shortcomings of the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program, and we'll give some temporary relief to those job creators hardest hit by COVID-19, the small and medium-sized businesses. The second new support that we're announcing today is aimed at those who've had their operations shut down or severely curtailed by the pandemic and public health measures over the past 3 months. Those small and medium-sized businesses who have less than 500 employees and are struggling to reopen their doors will be eligible for a one-time relaunch payment of up to 15% of monthly sales revenue to a maximum of $5,000. To ensure businesses and nonprofits have access to the capital needed to reopen, Alberta's government is committing up to $200 million to relaunch funding to assist them with the costs of reopening their businesses, like the costs of implementing enhanced measures to prevent the spread of the virus, or rent, other supplies, employee wages, or replacing inventory. These measures are in addition to the many actions Alberta's government's already taken as part of our economic recovery strategy to support job creators and to get people back to work during the global crisis. We have committed some $13 billion in direct cash support to Albertans, to job creators, as well as deferrals and liquidity measures and other steps, including, for example, assuming $350 million of Workers' Compensation Board premiums. We are eating those costs as a provincial government, 50% of the payments for SMEs this year. We are freezing the education portion of property taxes. That represents an $87 million saving for job creators and a $55 million saving for homeowners. We've extended the filing deadline for returns to the corporate registry and so many other regulatory compliance measures. We've deferred collection of business income taxes, which represents $1.5 billion of support for liquidity for job creators during this tough time. We're forgiving the tourism levy from hoteliers and other lodging businesses, which represents a savings for them of up to $27 million this year. We provided the emergency isolation payment that helped many who had to stay home when they were sick at the beginning of the crisis, and that was an $108 million expenditure. And as I mentioned, we've committed $67 million to the Commercial Emergency Rent Assistance Program in partnership with the federal government, and that will now be strengthened with the legislation that we will be bringing forward as a result of today's announcement. As I say, these measures represent a large portion of the $13 billion in action taken by Alberta's government to help protect livelihoods during the pandemic. Part of the return on that investment is that it has allowed us to move quicker than most on our relaunch strategy. We started lifting restrictions, of course, back on May 1, a couple of weeks ago, after the initial peak of infections, and by May 14, in most of the province, and May 25, in the virus epicenters of Calgary and Brooks, phase 1 of the relaunch was fully underway. Businesses have demonstrated incredible resilience throughout this pandemic, as have Albertans generally, and many were chomping at the bit to get back to work. They've also shown tremendous social responsibility in going to the province's BizConnect website and carefully implementing the public health guidelines. More sectoral guidelines will be released early next week. Speaking of next week, as we move towards phase 2 of the relaunch, which I hope and believe is coming sooner than expected, we need to do more to ensure that our small and medium-sized job creators can help catapult Alberta into economic recovery as quickly and as strongly as possible. As I mentioned today, new supports, the new supports announced today complement previous efforts to help businesses come through the COVID crisis, including our major initiative to reduce their burden by deferring WCB premiums. Let me just close by saying that altogether, the fiscal action we've taken to protect livelihoods during this pandemic represents about 4% of the size of Alberta's economy, which is leading the country in terms of our economic response, and we've only just begun. Later this month, the government will be releasing the outlines of our economic recovery strategy that will not only address these short-term urgent challenges, but the medium to long-term rebuild of Alberta's economy, including a huge emphasis on diversification while ensuring a future for our largest sector, oil and gas. But at the end of the day, we're not going to have a strong economy unless we have strong, small, and medium-sized businesses. They're the heart and core of our economy, and today's announcement, I think, is great news for them. So with that, Minister Fir and I are happy to take any questions.
Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Thank you. The first question is from Emma Graney of the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Yeah, g'day guys. This question is for the Premier. Today the International Energy Agency and also OECD have said to government, quit your fossil fuel subsidies. It's not something which we should be doing. That includes tax breaks. It also includes any kind of subsidies at all in terms of investment. You may have known that CAP yesterday was calling for that exact thing, the tax break. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on what the Energy Agency and OECD are saying. And also related to that, there's some frustration in the oil sector about businesses unable to get their hands on any of the supports federally, talking through BDC and EDC, because there's just no clarity there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering where the province is at on a provincial support package, which you guys said earlier you might be looking at.
Right. So first of all, just making a note of this, the various questions. Thank you, Emma. On the first question, there are no subsidies for oil and gas. It's a myth, at least in Canada. Perhaps some of the, in this country, we are one of the only major oil and gas producers in the world, apart from the United States, where oil and gas exploration, production, and development is done by private sector market companies and not by government-controlled state-owned enterprises. So I'm sure that in places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, OPEC states, where the oil companies are effectively state-owned enterprises, that there are implicit subsidies embedded for those oil and gas companies. That's simply not the case here in Canada. It's true that in the past there were policies designed to incentivize economic activity in oil and gas, but that's true of many industries. And there simply is no subsidy program here. I mean, so I'm not sure what more to say about that. In terms of the liquidity measures to support, to ensure a future for major employers, including tourism, airlines, energy producers, and others who have been particularly hard hit in the crisis, I agree. There seems to have been very little access to the federal credit facilities that were announced both for medium-sized producers through BDC, EDC, and more recently the large employers emergency finance facility. We continue to work closely with the federal government to ensure that those programs are accessible, to clarify the rules, and so that they're actually useful. There's no point in announcing something that no employer can actually access. At the same time, we continue to work on our own prospective Alberta credit facility for large employers who are facing particular distress because of the coronavirus recession, and just stay tuned for more information on that in the days to come.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Thank you. The next question is from Chris Varco of the Calgary Herald. Please go ahead.
Hi, I have two questions. The first question is for the minister. I'm wondering, what is the criteria for which businesses can access the money, and what are the specific areas that they have to spend the money for? That's my first question. The second one is for the Premier. Today, the jobs report, as you indicated, there seems to be some signs that maybe the job losses weren't as extreme as were expected by some economists. As well, we're seeing some oil prices now getting closer towards $40. I guess I'm wondering whether that's changing your assessment of how quickly or how slowly the recovery in Alberta is going to be economically.
Thanks for that question. So the intention of the grant is to have it be applied to small businesses who were forced to close or severely curtailed as a result of the public measures in place. There'll be more details about the eligibility for the program that will be coming out soon, but that's the main focus, is those that through no fault of their own were forced to shut down. And with respect to where they can spend the money, I don't imagine that we'll be highly prescriptive on that, but again, more details will follow. It's intended for things like inventory, supplies, wages, rent, putting in protective measures. We know that the small businesses know best where to effectively spend that money. But as I say, more details to come.
Yeah. And just to add to Tanya's answer, the real goal of the $5,000 maximum relaunch grants for SMEs that had to shut down or were severely impaired by the public health measures. The goal is really to help them with a portion of their fixed costs. So it's 15% of their average revenues and up to a maximum of $5,000. And I can give you a couple of examples of where that might come in. So I have a friend who runs a small restaurant in Edmonton here, and because of the the slowdown and then the crisis, even before his restaurant had to close, he wasn't able to make his last payroll installment. So to restart and get people back to work, this kind of grant could help to pay back payroll, and that helps workers who have been affected by this as well. Obviously, small businesses have got to restock their inventories. And let me say that I know there were quite understandably a lot of small businesses in the restaurant sector in Calgary that were ticked off about the 10-day delay in reopening sit-down service at 50% capacity in Calgary and Brooks. A difficult decision that we took on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer because of the concern around undetected or other untraced new cases in those cities at the time. And I was asked at the time, Chris, if we would consider providing compensation for those businesses that did order inventory with the expectation of an earlier opening, and I think they can consider this a form of compensation. And I also want to add, this is a government that believes in Alberta free market principles and fiscal conservatism. We don't believe in corporate or business welfare, and we don't believe in heavy-handed government intervention in the economy. These are extraordinary times, and these businesses are not suffering because of anything that they did. It's not because of any bad management decisions on their part. It's not because of a market failure. They had to shut their doors because of government-mandated policies to keep us safe and healthy. And I see this as a form of a kind of regulatory taking. And so I believe, I've thought long and hard about this, that there's a kind of ethical obligation on the government. We can't make all of these businesses whole, but this is, I think, certainly a boost that can help many of them get back to work. On the broader question on the economy, you're right. We're pleased to see a couple of things happening, that unemployment, at least officially, the top-line unemployment number has not gone to the sort of 25% range that we were expecting a couple of months back. On the other hand, as I said, I think the official unemployment stats disguise the real picture to some extent. A lot of economists have, and including our own Tanya's department, have done an analysis which shows that if you also account for the tens of thousands of people who've left the labor market altogether over the past 3 months, and if you were to measure today's employment numbers against an average size, like the pre-COVID size of the labor force, you're getting closer to something like a 25% unemployment number. So I don't think we should, look, we'll take whatever good news we can get, and it's great to see tens of thousands of people coming back into the workforce and getting employed again. And as we accelerate relaunch, I expect that momentum to pick up. Also worth noticing that today's labor force survey was taken in mid-May, so there's been additional economic activity through reopening since then. So I think we can look, let's hope, and I believe that actually we've seen the bottom of the trough, and that we're going to see employment continue to come back. The challenging part is, as more jobs are created, more people will move back into the labor force, so the overall 15% unemployment stat will probably continue, I suspect, for some time. And, as I've said many times, we can expect Alberta, together with Newfoundland, to have a worse story, a worse experience on joblessness because of the double whammy with the oil price crisis. And speaking of that, it is good to see WTI back up to 40 and WCS, I think, about $32. This means that that's a price that is a break even for many of our large producers. As you know, at the height of the crisis, we were giving away Western Canadian oil at negative prices. So it is a huge improvement from there. And I think this is an important indication that there is a future for our industry, that our producers will get through this if they operate with care. The problem is, Chris, it means that they've pretty much all stripped out their capital budgets. That affects jobs. And we don't expect to see prices recover to something in the $55, $65 range for 12 to 18 months because of the size of global inventories. On the other hand, apparently OPEC will be making a decision tomorrow to extend by another month their significant production cutbacks. And we've seen more than anticipated shut-ins of U.S. energy production and a faster recovery of demand. So let's take all of these things as reasons for cautious optimism.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Thank you. Yes. Lisa Johnson, Post Media.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering how you're going to define landlords who act unfairly, and where that's going to leave some businesses who might be in a dispute with their landlords. And I'm also wondering if you can address, critics might say that you dragged your feet on this file, especially since the NDP has been calling for a rent eviction for a couple of weeks now, and roughly $5,000 of support for businesses who are looking to relaunch.
Sure. Well, as I said, the commercial tenant eviction protection will focus on protecting commercial renters from eviction or non-payment of rent due to the COVID-19 public health crisis, so that the new measures will help address shortfalls in the current Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program and will give eligible business owners peace of mind as they reopen. Additional details will be provided next week, but we are looking very closely at the measures announced last week by the BC government in this respect. If commercial landlords refuse to participate in the rent assistance program and pass on its savings to their employees and are then in turn threatening to evict their employees in the short term, that would be the kind of criteria which would trigger protection. Alberta has never before had a commercial, in terms of the timelines here, many provinces have had commercial tenant protection legislation. We've never had that before in Alberta. And so this is a new area for us, and it's taken some time to develop the policy framework. That legislation will be forthcoming shortly in Alberta's legislature. And we also have wanted to make sure, look, you're channeling criticism from the opposition saying that this has taken too long. The reality is that we've acted bigger and faster in protecting livelihoods, including employers, than I think any other province, with $13 billion of measures. And so we've gone far further than most other provinces in many of these areas. And this is just additional support. Tanya, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So we also wanted to make sure we found that, in addition to, as Premier said, all of the supports that we put in place so far, we also wanted to find that right balance between timely additional supports, but also taking the time to assess the impact of the federal programs that had come out, the impact of the deferrals and supports that we took into place, continue to listen to the small businesses themselves and the business associations to find out what they needed, assess some of the data that we've had come in so far to our online survey tool, where commercial landlords and tenants can submit information. So take the time to assess all of that information before determining what additional supports we wanted to roll out, to make sure those supports are the most beneficial, effective programs and supports that fill the gaps. And we wanted to make sure we got that right.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Yes. Chris Epp, CTV Calgary.
Premier, that subsidy that was announced, I think in April, where you set aside $67 million was meant to address this issue. I'm wondering is how much of that 67 has actually been distributed, and it sounds like the province maybe didn't get the uptake they expected from landowners. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. We don't have the figure about how much has been drawn down on the rent assistance program. It's administered by the federal government, although we are contributing our share. What we've heard anecdotally from small businesses is that in many cases, their commercial landlords are not signing up for the rent assistance program. And frankly, it doesn't make any sense to me because, first of all, this would, the landlord would have to cover a quarter of the cost, but they get to keep the tenant. And the federal and provincial governments come in paying half the cost of rent. So in this economic situation, it makes no sense for a commercial landlord to kick out a tenant when there's going to be no one to fill that space. Now, there might be some cases where perhaps a commercial tenant hasn't been paying their rent for months upon months, well before COVID, and maybe they're there's always small cases of bad tenants who maybe violate their covenants and so on. So, there has to be reasonable grounds upon which evictions can happen, because you have to respect the businesses and the rights of landlords as well in all of this. So you can't put a blanket ban on evictions, because that would completely freeze up the whole rental market, and it would have a lot of negative unintended consequences. But in the case where you've got a viable business that's desperately trying to survive the COVID, and the landlord refuses to accept a 50% subsidy on rent for 2 or 3 months, doesn't make any sense. And so today's announcement is a pretty significant nudge to the commercial landlords who are not cooperating to get with the program.
Okay, we have time for 3 more. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Yes, thank you. The next question is from Sammy Hudas, Post Media. Please go ahead.
Hi there, Premier. You've mentioned that you're confident not only that Stage 2 of the relaunch will go ahead on time or ahead of schedule, but that some activities previously designated for Stage 3 could even be a part of that. I'm wondering, when the province was moving into Stage 1 of the relaunch, we were told 2 triggers must be met: that hospitalization rates have not increased by more than 5% over the previous week, and that ICU occupancy being at less than 50% of capacity. So I'm wondering, what are the specific criteria that will determine whether Alberta can move into Stage 2 either around June 19th or earlier as hoped?
Well, we'll be making a final decision on these issues on Monday at the Emergency Management Cabinet Committee, and making an announcement early next week. You're aware of what the key criteria are, and the key triggers to watch are the levels of hospitalization and ICU admissions, which continue to go down. As of yesterday at 3 p.m., we were down to 48 COVID patients in hospital and only 6 in ICU province-wide, and down to 215 active cases. And we're now been averaging for most of the past several days about only 15 new cases, even while we're ramping up tests. That's 15 new cases on an average of about 4,000 tests. So only about 0.35, 0.4% of tests are coming back positive. And this means a number of things. First of all, even less stress in the hospital system. We're at 4% utilization of COVID-designated hospital beds. And it also means, with the small number of new cases, that we can get right on those with the tracing, tracking, and containment measures. And so these are the trends which have given, I'm not sure if Dr. Hinshaw's doing a news conference later on today, but you could ask her next time she's up. It's given our public health people a sense of confidence that we can move forward a little more quickly and a little right across the board with relaunch. But it's important at the same time that Albertans remember we're not out of the woods on this thing, okay? So I think a lot of people think, the number that folks in Edmonton here say there's almost no new cases, and so, it's kind of back to normal. Folks, we're not back to normal. We've got to continue to be careful. Keep that physical distancing, keep those good hygiene practices, the hand washing, avoid non-essential travel of great distances, stay home if you're sick. All of those basic rules, follow the public health guidelines, because we've seen around the world a number of places that relaxed their public health restrictions only to see significant spikes in new cases requiring further crackdowns. To be honest, I fully expect that we will see future surges. We need to be prepared for that. We need to be ready for it. And that's why we can't proceed. There's some folks out there that would like us just to open everything up right now, remove all restrictions and guidelines. That would not be responsible.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Thank you very much. The next question is from Tom Ross, 660 News.
Hi, Premier. I just wanted to get some comment on the mass protests that have been happening recently, especially here in Calgary. What are your thoughts on these Black Lives Matter demonstrations? And moving ahead, what role will the province play in addressing systemic racism in Alberta?
Well, with respect to protests generally, we remind people that there is a limit in the public health guidelines, or not the guidelines, the public health orders of 50 people at outdoor events. And we want to remind people, if they feel passionately about an issue, there's lots of ways to express that passion that don't require getting into a large crowd that could potentially become a super spreader event. So we would encourage people, use their freedom of speech, 100%, contact media, the legislators, use social media, use all of those tools. If people end up going out and joining large numbers of other folks against the public health measures, we would plead with them to maintain physical distancing and to wear a face covering and to avoid shouting and those kinds of things that could create transmission of the COVID-19 virus. So, there are legitimate issues that people are talking about absolutely these days, including racism, and we as a society need to come together and redouble our efforts to combat racism. Racism is sadly a reality in our own society here in Alberta. I think we're a lot better than most places around the world in Canada when it comes to respecting human dignity and equality of all before the law, but we have our own sad history of institutional racism. You know, one of the things I worked on proudly as the federal multiculturalism minister was the federal government's redress and apology for racist policies like the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. And you know that Prime Minister Laurier actually signed an order blocking black people from entering Canada back in the first decade of the last century. I mean, we've had, obviously, Aboriginal residential schools and so many other sad examples of institutionalized racism in our history. But I think the greatness of Canada is that we strive to learn to overcome those things and always to do better. And I think that the message that we're hearing loud and clear is we need to redouble those efforts so that we are truly a society characterized by equality of opportunity. But once again, I would plead with folks, whatever the cause is that they have, please try to be respectful of the public health measures because it would be a real tragedy if we have large gatherings, people shouting close to each other, that end up with the unintended consequence of widespread transmission, potentially folks back in hospital and losing a lot of the ground that we've gained thanks to people's personal responsibility over the past 3 months.
Okay, time for one more. Operator, can you please put through the last caller?
Thank you. Brittany Gervais, St. Albert Gazette.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So for this grant, it sounds like SMEs could receive 15% of their average revenue. I'm curious about how this could apply for new small businesses that opened before COVID hits and don't have a lot of revenue to report. Will they be able to receive some compensation as well?
That is a good question. I don't have the answer. Tanya, do you know?
So it is a good question, and stay tuned for that information. We're still working on the types of guidelines and rules that are going to apply, so we will have information on that forthcoming very soon.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Everyone.